Today we're going to be talking about a later development in Zen, an important figure named Dogen, and particularly a text called the Shobogenzo. So I'm going to talk about, like all the other ones, I'm going to talk about a little bit of background about Dogen, a little bit about the text, and then I'm going to cover some key ideas. One is this practice called Zazen, also known as sitting Zen. There's an idea of being time. That's called Uji in Japanese. We're going to talk about Buddha nature, which we heard a little bit about when we talked about Huineng last time. And we're going to talk about a particular view that Dogen has about practice, about Buddhist practice and its place. So as far as this class goes, Dogen's a fairly recent writer. He's writing in the 13th century. So to give you some time scale, that's like around the time of Aquinas, there's a famous Persian poet named Sadi writing at the same time. Sadi is great, check him out. So that's when he's writing. He's an illegitimate child of nobility. He's starts as a monk in a certain sect of Buddhism that focused on the Lotus Sutra, which, if we had more time, we definitely would have talked about. But alas, we do not have more time. But basically, they emphasize the idea that everyone is inherently enlightened. That's what they... and we talked about a little bit, I think, way back when we talked about the life story of the historical Buddha. We talked about some people who think that the Buddha just didn't actually renounce the world or go through all these trials. He only pretended to do that because he was always already enlightened. So that is associated with the Lotus Sutra, and so they think that. So then, because he's part of this sect that thinks that everyone's kind of inherently enlightened, he has this kind of question where he's like, well, if everyone's already enlightened, why do we do practice? Why do we do Buddhist practices? Any of this stuff that we're doing, why are we doing it? Because we're already enlightened. So he's asking around. Nobody in Japan has a good answer. So he decides to go to China because China's Buddhism came to Japan from China. So he's like, well, I'm going to go back kind of to the proximate source at least. He stays in China for about 5 years. He studies Chan. He doesn't like, we talked about koans before, these kind of, what is the sound of one hand clapping kind of things to jog you out of conceptual thought. He's not really wild about that kind of practice. He doesn't like it. He moves back to Japan. He runs a temple outside of Kyoto. And he ends up being kind of founding figure in a type of Zen called Soto, one of the main types of Zen in Japan. So, that's enough about Dogen. The title translates as the treasury of the true Dharma Eye. Nobody calls it that. Everyone always calls it the Shobogenzo. They all talk about it in the untranslated title. So, like the Dhammapada, some texts the original title just kind of stuck, or the Bhagavad Gita. Shobogenzo is just one of those. People talk about it that way. So the title kind of refers to the Buddhist teachings, particularly, so the Dharma Eye is the Buddhist teachings, particularly the aspects of the Buddha's enlightenment that were not written down. So remember the flower sermon where Mahakashapa, Buddha holds up the flower, doesn't say anything, and Mahakashapa smiles because he gets this kind of non-conceptual direct experience thing. But that's around, there's other texts that have this title. Some of them may have been inspired by Dogen, but definitely nowadays when people say Shobogenzo, they're talking about Dogen's Shobogenzo. It's a collection of short works, a kind of essay collection. They're in fact called fascicles because they were kind of published separately. But for some reason, people use this obscure English word fascicles when they talk about Dogen. Different versions have different numbers. Early versions have about 28. The modern version has 95, but versions vary. So some of the fascicles are more famous than others. There's some that you can get different collections of them that have been translated and sort of recombined. An important feature of this text is that it's written in Japanese rather than classical Chinese. So Japanese literature kind of starts around 800. These classics, The Tale of Genji, Pillow Book, and actually, interestingly, there's a lot of the founding writers in classical Japanese literature are women, because at the time, men were educated to write in classical Chinese. So if you were an educated, smart man, you wrote in classical Chinese. And women wrote in Japanese. But then, of course, a few hundred years later, when people sort of want some classics of Japanese literature, turns out luckily they had a bunch of women who were writing in it. So Dogen writes it in Japanese rather than classical Chinese, which is kind of notable. And in fact, so notable that in the 1770s, someone translated it into kind of more respectable classical Chinese. So this is something where we've seen a couple of times where it's like people have these prejudices about what language, Sanskrit is important, classical Chinese is important, Japanese is less important, Pali is less important. All these kind of bad prejudices that people have, but they're around. But that kind of made it kind of more accessible and more uniquely Japanese. So it's written between 1231 and 1253. Dogen edits and re-edits them during his life. After he dies, other people start editing them. Its importance is a little bit modern, so people studying it really closely doesn't happen until about the 15th century. And in the early 20th century, people really start studying it. So it's kind of, although it's old from 1200s, interest in it is a little bit recent, or widespread interest in it.